welcome you all here. Thank you for being here. We know the air conditioning is on, but we also know it's air conditioning light. So we appreciate you coming to this space. And so at Eastern State, we are intentionally preserving the past, and we're preserving this historic site, one of trauma, one of pain, but also one that originally called in 1787, and then when it opened in 1829, for a site and a place and a mission to remember the human dignity in everyone. So we believe it is unbelievably important to have not only conversations about the pain and trauma that happened here, but also the energy and the effort to reclaim sites like this one to do good. Reclaim sites like this one to heal. And when we talk about Juneteenth and the idea behind freedom, this is exactly what Dr. Brown said earlier today, that a site that so often removed people's freedom and liberty is exactly where we should be calling for liberty and freedom as we go forward. Thank you. So one of the things that we wanted to do today is dive into the historical foundation around Juneteenth, and that historical foundation around freedom, around liberty, around independence, all those conversations. So many people in the field of civic education talk about Juneteenth as the beginning of the civic season. This civic season from Freedom Day to Freedom Day. When we look at Juneteenth to July 4th, July 2nd, and question what Frederick Douglass did in the past. What to me is this day? Where have we lived up to freedom? Where have we lived up to independence? Where have we lived up to the liberty that we are all promised in those words of we the people, meaning all of us, and where have we not? So it's not only to recognize our past and to celebrate so many people that came before us to make freedoms happen, but to question what is the enduring legacy and where have we not lived up to that freedom? So we get to dive into this with my favorite scholar, Hasan Jeffries. You're at Ohio State. You've written so many books around how to teach and celebrate the civil rights movement. And Hasan, when you talk about that, we're not just talking about the 1940s and the 1960s. Could you give us a little context of how you see this constellation of civil rights as echoes over time through American history?
Of course. But first, let me say thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you all for spending a little bit of Juneteenth with us here today. In a past visit, I remember visiting the synagogue that's here, but I didn't know that we had a church here too, because we just had a little church, a black church too, right here in this space. So that was wonderful. One of the things that we do in the classroom that's unfortunate is we stop talking about slavery too soon. And I'm hoping that with Juneteenth as a federal holiday, we'll stop talking about slavery too soon. And the reason why it's important not to stop talking about slavery too soon, in other words, the Civil War happens, emancipation occurs, and therefore we're no longer going to talk about the institution of slavery, is because it's enslaved folk, African Americans, while they are in bondage, who craft the freedom dream that black people will be pursuing for the next 150 plus years. We don't take enslaved people seriously enough as political thinkers. There's no folk who had a better understanding of what freedom meant than those people who were living in such proximity to people who enjoyed their freedom and yet were denied those basic civil rights and human rights themselves. So at the moment of emancipation, for the first time for many, they have the chance to act on their belief in what basic civil rights and human rights that all people were entitled to. These are things that they held dear, that they understood. So at that moment of emancipation, whether we're talking about, in Virginia in April 1865, or Juneteenth in Galveston, Texas, or in 1861 in Hilton Head, South Carolina. Whenever that moment of emancipation came for African Americans, if we look at their actions, they tell us what it is that they wanted freedom to be. And that begins this, what I call not just a civil rights agenda, but a freedom rights agenda, a combination of both civil rights and human rights. Because you're right, it's not just in 55 when Rosa Parks sits down and King stands up, that black folk began fighting for this broad spectrum of basic civil rights and human rights. It's at that moment of emancipation that they begin fighting in a new way, because before emancipation, African Americans, no matter where they were, whether they were the 4 million who were bound in chains or the couple 100,000 who were free, the struggle then was to end slavery. It was literally to secure a literal freedom from the bondage of slavery. But after emancipation occurs, then the struggle is for these freedom rights, from freedom to freedom rights. And we see in the actions of black folk that they understand what freedom ought to be. One of the first things that they do is they go down to county courthouses. This is in April, May, June, July of 1865. The moment black folk receive word that slavery is over, they begin going down to county courthouses to register their marriages by law. They understood that freedom meant being able to hold and keep their families intact. One of the other things that they do is they begin to petition local officials, but the federal government in the form of union officers, and sending petitions up to Washington, D.C. and the Freedmen's Bureau, demanding, asking, pleading, petitioning for teachers and resources to create schools, education. One of the first rights, not a civil right, but a human right, that they begin to agitate for. And another, as I reflect back on and think about the moving performance that we just had, spiritual performance that we just had, one of the first things, thinking about what it is that black folk are pursuing, that they want, that they're defining in this moment of freedom, one of them is cultural autonomy. And part of that cultural autonomy meant worshiping the God that you wanted in the way that you wanted. And how do we know this? Not from what black folk were writing down at the moment of emancipation. There's a 90% illiteracy rate that gets dropped within 30 years, within a generation, to 30%, one of the biggest, quickest plunges in human history. But what do? They're telling us what they want with their actions. And one of the first actions that they take is they leave white churches and begin to form their own churches. They say, you can take that God that you were worshiping, and we're going to worship a God that believes in freedom and justice. So that moment of emancipation shines a light on what it is that black folk had been wanting and slave folk had been wanting, African Americans had been wanting all along, but once they get the opportunity to pursue it, they exercise it. So that's why we know what will come a century later that we call the civil rights movement has its roots in this much longer struggle for freedom and justice.
Wonderful. Few million things I want to unpack there, but I'll try to stay focused. So I think it's unbelievably grounding to frame this around those basic human rights. You know, we talk about Eastern State as a place that originated with this understanding of ensuring that every single person was respected for the human dignity that they had, for that spark of divinity in every single person. And this, when we look at the struggle for human rights around enslavement, around freedom, we look at these echoes of the basic rights of our country that are framed in, before 1776, but then are codified in 1787 with the Constitution. You're talking right to contract, right to marriage, right to your identity, right to religious beliefs. These are not just human rights, they're natural rights. No government shall ever take them away from people, yet people did not have them, and enslaved people did not have them, and then people who were black and brown did not have them afterwards. So we look at the struggle of the call to freedom. We read about Desmond Tutu and Gandhi talking about the people that know joy the most are the ones that go through the deepest pain. The people that know freedom the most are the ones that had it removed from them. You understand it in a stronger way when you see freedom being removed from not just you, but your family, that you have no control over you as an individual being. So we see this kind of build up to the Civil War, to the Emancipation Proclamation, to the Reconstruction Amendments, and we see these voices being codified into these documents. So can you just walk us through a little bit of a timeline when we talk about starting to codify in the legal system the freedom that leans into Juneteenth, but then the other legal documents and assemblies and work that people have to do, because just because you put it in the Constitution doesn't mean it sticks. So all the work around it. So can you give us that? I love a good timeline when we talk about American history. So do you mind walking us through that timeline?
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think you begin that timeline when we're thinking about the major documents and the critical moments in American history with, of course, we usually begin with the Constitution, 1787, or the Declaration of Independence, 1776. But I think it's important if we actually go back a little further, right, to 1741, South Carolina, following a major insurrection in the colony of South Carolina, which had one of the largest enslaved populations among the American colonies. 1771, white South Carolinians rewrite what is considered their slave code, the laws that govern and apply only to African Americans. And one of the things that they do in there is they say that any white person can stop any black person and question their freedom, question what they are doing. And if that black person, ask them for their papers, ask them for a pass, any white person, not just a constable, not just somebody who's been deputized, any white person, authorizing any white person to do this. And if that black person refuses to produce papers or resists in any way, then that white person can take that black person's life on the spot without consequence. This is law that then gets replicated in colonial laws and then eventually in state laws from that period until emancipation. And so as we sit here in Eastern Penitentiary and we're talking about, sort of how do we, the sort of history of justice and injustice, but then also policing black bodies, that one of the things that we don't really fully appreciate is the way that power in American history has always extended beyond those who wear a badge to all white people. And that's something I think we have to wrestle with. And then we move from there to the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. We have to be very clear. It sounds nice. But in the moment in time, it is clear that most people who are here now did not fall under the definition of the men that they were referring to then. Most white people didn't. No black people did. No women did. Indigenous folk did not. Immigrants did not. And so it was very narrowly defined. That's fine. It is what it is. It sounds good. It's universal language. We understand in the moment that it did not apply universally, but we look to it. We're coming up on the 250th anniversary of it. It was put down on paper, and as I used to say growing up in Brooklyn, no take-backs. You put it down, you can't take it back. This is the reason why you have to push back against this sort of legal argument that the Supreme Court conservatives like to bounce around, call originalism, right? We have to go back to the original intent of what the framers and the founders want. Well, not me, right? Because most of that stuff didn't apply to me. Most of that stuff didn't apply to us. So we can't play that game. One of the beauties of these founding documents is that we have, over time, been allowed to expand and extend the definitions and the meanings. They're right. It didn't apply to us. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't take that universal principle and now apply it in the present. That's critically important. It's also important when we think about 1787 in the U.S. Constitution to recognize that the U.S. Constitution was a slaveholder's document, right? It was written, designed to maintain and provide protections for the institution of slavery. Now you say that now, and you got police knocking on your door. Like, what are you talking? This is just history. This is what it is. It shouldn't be a secret. It doesn't fundamentally change what the document is, but it is what it is. You got folk running around now talking about, well, the framers of the Constitution were really abolitionists, and they planted in the seeds of the Constitution what we needed to abolish slavery. If they were abolitionists, they were the worst damn abolitionists that ever existed, right? Because it would take 100 years and a bloody civil war to actually abolish the institution of slavery. So we have to be clear that this is what we're working with. So again, to go back to that sort of originalist argument, that doesn't work, right? Because the original intent of things like the Second Amendment wasn't to provide individual protections. It was to create a police force against the very likelihood of insurrection by who? Enslaved people. Like, that context matters for how we are adjudicating issues in the contemporary moment. So we have to look at the Constitution, particularly the original aspects of it, with sort of a skeptical eye. So that's why when we fast forward to 1865 and we wind up getting the three Reconstruction amendments, I think it's critically important just to take just a small half step back to the Gettysburg Address, which is Abraham Lincoln. And Abraham Lincoln in the Gettysburg Address says, looking back at the Constitution, yeah, that thing was flawed because it didn't apply to everybody, and it actually provides protections for enslavers and the institution of slavery. And he says we need to rethink how we got here. And this is when he offers us thinking about America as a government being of the people, for the people, and by the people. He's like, let's expand what we mean by, one, the people, but then also center this on the people. That's critically important. Now, we do get carried away with Abraham Lincoln, right? The great emancipator. We've been doing that for a century and a half, right? Because he's like, oh, we got one good white guy. But look, Abraham Lincoln, like everybody else, believed in white supremacy. Right, like that, we can't. I mean, I teach at Ohio State, the Ohio State University, home of national champions. I teach at Ohio State, so we're up north, and you know, the kids come in. Abraham Lincoln, the great emancipator, he believed in white supremacy like every other white person in America. Right, there were like 3 white people who didn't believe in white supremacy, and John Brown was one of them. Right, John Brown was real. That's somebody who we need to hold up. John Brown was so serious. He said, I'm not only willing to give up my life, right, for my brothers, as he's called them, my brothers and sisters who are in bondage, but I'm willing to give up the life of my children. And 2 of his sons die at Harper's Ferry. But that's important when we think about, especially thinking about Juneteenth and emancipation, how emancipation comes about. You know, the emancipation, because we could be, and this ties into sort of these documents, right, which are important, sort of legal documents, these critical documents in American history. Like we've settled on sort of Juneteenth, which is very local. Right? I mean, it's when, as we know, black folk in Galveston, Texas, receive word that the war has ended, slavery is over. It's very local in that sense. You know, here in Philadelphia, people weren't, you know, in 1865, they weren't marking Juneteenth. In 1865, they were marking January 1, just as they were in 1864, and just as they began in 1863, because it was January 1 in 1863 in Bethel, Mother Bethel and other churches around the city, in Boston and in New York, where black folk came waiting for the Emancipation Proclamation to go into effect. Abraham Lincoln issues it 100 days, September 22nd, 1862, 100 days before January 1, 1863. But when he issues the Emancipation Proclamation, he's really giving the South one last chance to come back into the Union. Like, the Emancipation Proclamation doesn't actually free anybody. It's a military document. It says, listen, to white Southerners who are in rebellion, if you lay down your arms, you can keep your enslaved people. Lincoln is willing to make that sacrifice because he knew and he goes into it saying, no, this is going to be a war to preserve the Union. If I can keep the Union with maintaining the institution of slavery where it is, that's fine. And so the Emancipation Proclamation does not free a single soul. And those people who Lincoln could have freed with the Emancipation Proclamation, because it says that those enslaved Africans who are in territories that are still within the Union, that those folk are still enslaved. He could have freed them with the stroke of a pen, and he doesn't. The Emancipation Proclamation actually enslaves more people than it frees, because those black folk in places like New Orleans wind up going back into slavery. So what is the document? It's important, right? Because now you're saying that freedom is on the table, and this is why black folk gather on New Year's Eve, 1862, going into 1863, waiting for that moment where the Emancipation Proclamation would go into effect. But they also realized that the Emancipation Proclamation said that black men can fight in the war. We can enlist black men, and that was critical, right? Because they were the force that was clamoring to be a part of this war. Frederick Douglass is telling Abraham Lincoln from the beginning, you have to make this a war about freedom, and black folk are willing to serve, and they do. His sons serve in the Massachusetts 54th. Now, people like to point to Frederick Douglass and be like, look, Frederick Douglass had this good relationship with Abraham Lincoln. Of course, Abraham Lincoln was a racial egalitarian. Frederick Douglass was his one black friend, and he ain't even listened to him, because he's saying make this about freedom, right? And so Emancipation Proclamation is critical, but, you know, that's one of the things that, even to this day, there's a community in Ohio that have had for over 150 years celebrating sort of Emancipation Day, right? And so you had these various sort of moments. And then for others, after 1865, for many generations into the early 20th century, you had folk who would mark December, early December, as the day to celebrate this transition from slavery to freedom, because that's when the 13th Amendment was signed. So you get the 13th Amendment signing in December of 1865 saying slavery is abolished except for punishment of a crime. Then you get the 14th Amendment granting citizenship rights, which we need to pay real close attention to that, right? Because that's before the court too, and people are trying to undo that. And then the 15th Amendment is when we get voting rights extended to African American men. But those three become enshrined in the Constitution, but you get the Reconstruction Acts, which Congress first passes in 1867, signed into law in March of 1867, that gives African American men the right to vote, divides the state up into military districts, the South into military districts. But we see, taking African Americans and enslaved folks seriously, newly free people seriously as political thinkers, as soon as they're not waiting for the 15th Amendment, as soon as African American men get the franchise by law, they begin registering in mass. Like counties that were 80% African American in Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina, as soon as it's possible, in April, in May, in June, in July, thousands of black men are registering to vote, the very first chance they get, because they understand the power of the ballot. And I just found out recently that to make it personal, right, that my grandfather's grandfather, who was enslaved in Jasper County, Georgia, for some 40 years, in 1867, in July 6th, 2 days after the 4th of July, just found his voter registration form and signature, the X marked with his full name. The first chance that he got, like so many others, when it became possible, they registered to vote, right? Because they understand the power of the ballot. Not to change everything, but they say, in order for us to be a part of this body politic, we have to have a say in who gets to office.
And I'm going to wrap my head around this idea of Juneteenth. So we see these echoes over time of the fight for freedom, and we see these big moments over time, like New Year's Eve and New Year's Day, that being a huge celebration. And once I started learning about that, I never celebrated New Year's Eve the same way again. Now it had so much more context and so much more power than just what it had turned into in American times. We see Juneteenth as like almost the consolidation of all these moments over time. But as we think through these moments, each time that they happen, there's always a moment that you feel like it's going to switch the gears. It's going to make a change. But then the doubling down that has to happen to make that come through. So, just reading the other day around, it is 1954, Brown versus Ed comes down, and it is years, 2 to 3 years later, before the government, the president, anybody even starts to consider desegregating schools. Years after the Supreme Court said, do it and do it with haste. That takes so long. So when we think about that power, not just of those significant dates, to remember and to say, it's always about that action that has to come next to change the minds and the hearts of people that don't want it to happen, and also to make it a reality. How much does those moments in time affect the outcome of American history today? So we talk about the Emancipation Proclamation, which, again, just read the document, and you can see right in that document where people who are enslaved are freed, where they're not, and that it is an act of war during a war movement to say, this is how I'm going to leverage it. But it's that amazing piece that says, you can fight. That changes the outcome of the Civil War. Those men who fight and the women that support them in that fight, that changes the outcome. Could you talk a little bit about that change? And then, it always hurts people's brains when they're like, oh, the 15th Amendment allows African American men the right to vote. It's not. It's before that. 95% of men vote for grant, of African American men that are registered to vote. 95% vote. Imagine that voter turnout in this country. 95%. They're not taking that for granted, and that gets grant in. So could you talk a little bit about these moments of freedom and then how the movement of the people push it forward? And then I want to talk a little bit about how does Juneteenth kind of be suppressed underground? And then how does it come back to be a moment? I mean, I need to shout out to Ron Brown here in Philadelphia. He is the coalition. That's who taught me everything about Juneteenth. He's the coalition of Pennsylvania around Juneteenth. And he's been running Juneteenth programs in full force for 30 years in Philadelphia. And so many cultural institutions in Philadelphia know how to do this, know what to do because of that man and the people working with him to get that message out. So could you talk a little bit about the power of the people and then the suppression of that freedom, and then how we can reclaim these moments of memory to call for more freedom?
Well, one of the reasons why it's important that we don't stop talking about slavery too soon in the classroom and in our public spaces is because the principal legacy of the institution of slavery is white supremacy. Like slavery is an economic institution. Like slavery doesn't exist for 250 years in America just because white people don't like black people, right? That's ridiculous. It's an economic institution that's designed to control black labor and regulate black behavior to generate enormous profit for a handful of wealthy white men, right? But it's rationalized and justified by racism. And so the privilege of white skin then gets buy-in in supporting an economic institution that actually only benefits a few people. That belief in white supremacy does not go away when the institution of slavery ends, right? And for some reason, I have to convince my students at The Ohio State University that after emancipation, white Southerners aren't like, oh, my bad, like, we ain't know y'all wanted to be free, right? Like we're sorry. Like, no, they're trying.
We can't let the Northerners out of it either.
They want to be on the right side of history, right? Yeah. Like my kids, they understand the Underground Railroad. Everybody wants to be, like, I ask my students, would you have been a conductor on the Underground Railroad? Like 100 students in the class, 90 of whom are white, all their hands go up. And I'm like, all right, if everybody was going to be a conductor, it wouldn't have to been underground, right? Like the point is that very few people were John Brown. Yeah. Doesn't take anything away from those who were actual abolitionists, but the majority of people are either opposed or agnostic or on the sidelines, right? Again, that white supremacy is so critical, right? And this is why you have school districts that don't want us talking about white supremacy as a belief system, right? Because that becomes the guiding ideology, shaping belief not only in southern states, but also in northern states, right? And it's a shared ideology. It's a shared belief. And so the idea, this enslaver's mentality persists after emancipation. And is rooted in this belief, rationalized by this belief in white supremacy, but it's because you have white Southerners who are trying to recreate the labor controls that they lost with the institution of slavery. And that enslaver mentality extends for a century plus. This idea that white people control and own black labor and black bodies. So black people are constantly fighting against that because that belief system never goes away. So that's how we go from the institution of slavery to a brief period where black people are trying to purchase and secure some land to quickly to sharecropping as a compromise because there is no land available. So they're like, at least we can control our labor and work on our own terms. But that quickly descends into farm tenancy and peonage and convict leasing, this whole idea of trying to control black labor. And so that is a legacy of the institution of slavery that black folk are experiencing in real time, while at the same time trying to fight against it. There is never a moment, and I heard some civil rights activists today I was in conversation with some of them a few days ago, and these were SNCC activists, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee activists, right, who were part of the first wave of sit-ins in 1960. So they're all in their 80s now, right, and they're still active. And we were sitting around, and one person was like, man, I didn't realize we would have to fight these fights now. And one of the activists said, so name a generation that didn't have to fight for their freedom. So this is your fight. Like what did you think you had done to have the privilege of not having to fight for your freedom? And so this is it. And when you look back over the generations, whether we're talking about that first generation after emancipation, they had to fight. Whether you're talking about that generation after Reconstruction, because Reconstruction doesn't fail, Reconstruction is defeated, they had to fight. Whether we're talking about black folk, whether they're in Philly or New York or in Boston, who have to deal with the rationalization of sort of controlling black labor in new northern urban spaces, as with the rise of this idea of criminalizing race and saying black people are inherently criminal, so therefore we have to treat them differently and begin to police them differently. I mean, this is what black folk have always had to fight against. but they've always been willing to fight. I mean, that's one of the important lessons coming out of this post-emancipation period, is there's never a moment where black people did not have to fight, and there's never a moment where they did not fight, right? So there's, this troubled waters today, but the history says that black folk know how to navigate through those waters, not because they want to, but because we have had to over the generations. So when we look back at that moment of emancipation, it is really critical, but it's really the beginning of another phase. You broke the chains, the literal chains of bondage, but gaining access to that broad spectrum of civil rights and human rights, that was another phase that they were going to have to engage in. So when you talk about the percentages of African American men who register to vote, they're doing it not just for themselves. That's a family vote. Black women didn't have the vote, but you better believe those brothers could not show up and vote for a former slaver, right, and think that he could go back home. I mean, so we have to recognize that as a collective vote. And then I think we also can't get too wrapped up. Well, let me just say one last thing and we'll get back. Is when we think about sort of what black folk are doing in the moment and the celebrations that they're having, right? And something like Juneteenth. It is both, and I think it can be both and should be both, and historically has always been both a commemoration and a celebration. Like the two can coexist together, and historically they really have. And so it's the commemoration of sort of those and honoring, and we saw this, turn of the 20th century, parades being held for black veterans of the Civil War, right? Whether it's, one of the things, they would always have a float in Juneteenth parades in Texas, or on Emancipation Day, New Year's Day, in Florida, for example, honoring those who helped the community persevere and survive, honoring that generation who weathered the worst that humanity had to offer institution of slavery. So that's the commemoration. We understand sort of where we came from, and a part of that is remembrance, pausing and saying like, this was terrible, right? This is human tragedy. This is humanity at its worst, and it exists in America for 2.5 centuries. And we have to remember that, right? For what it meant, and for what it meant individually, to families, to histories lost, to cultures what was severely impacted. We're going to commemorate those who endured, who survived, but we're also going to celebrate our survival. We're also going to celebrate the fact that we endured and we came out on the other side of that. And despite all the efforts to rob black folk, to rob us of our humanity and dignity, you can't. We're still here. Hearts still beating, heads still held high, right? And so that's why you have both those moments where you pause, but then you also celebrate, right? Where you can raise your voice and song. And the two, they can and they should coexist. One of the things that civil rights activists, because I've been interviewing them, for 2.5 decades now, is they say, what y'all, because they always throw me, right? They throw me in that group with y'all. It's like, what y'all don't understand, I mean historians and people, is that we had fun. Like, we laughed. We sang songs. We cracked jokes in the midst of facing terror, right? That's how we survived. That was part of it. We knew what we were doing. We were serious. This was, we were risking our lives. But we also had downtime, and in that downtime, we celebrated. That's the only way that we were able to preserve our humanity. And that's something that happens on a daily basis in that 20th century. But we also see enslaved folk doing the same thing. They came together and celebrated birthdays. They celebrated weddings. They mourned funerals. So these rituals are really important, right? Because they do preserve humanity. So something like, whether it's Juneteenth here, I didn't grow up growing up in New York. I didn't know about Juneteenth, right? When I was a kid, we didn't celebrate Juneteenth. We celebrated Black Solidarity Day, right? Which was something that happened in September. And sort of, his mom was like, I ain't going to work. It's Black Solidarity Day. I'm like, okay, right? But which makes sense in a place like New York, because you have such a global black community, the entirety of the diaspora, right? So something like, it wasn't until I went down to Morehouse College where cats coming over from Texas and the Southwest were like, yo, what are you doing for Juneteenth? And I was like, I don't know, what's Juneteenth, right? It was very much, so that's 35 years ago, right? I mean, damn, that's 35 years ago. But we saw that the power of it regionally, that, in each region you have different folk marking the same thing, but in their own way. And so whether it's Juneteenth that we have made the federal holiday, which is fine, whether it's Black Solidarity Day in New York City, whether it's Emancipation Day, January 1 somewhere else, it doesn't really matter what the day is. We settled on Juneteenth. That's fine. That had that cultural consistency over the century and a half, so that's great. It's what does it represent? It represents both that commemoration and celebration, and to me, that's what's most important.
Yeah, and I love that you bring up this idea about you need to come together in the most trying times and to recognize that human dignity. We see it in the research around the Tuskegee Airmen and their ability to get that first class through against all odds, against everything working against them, because they had community, because they had each other, and they would lift each other up. You get the best working community in the world because they're all in it together. They have a united cause to move each other forward, and at the same time, they're laughing with each other. They're friends. They're enjoying each other. We see it here at Eastern State. We have an amazing collection of artifacts because at the end of the day, if you were alone in a cell, you could still be able to make something. And making something and showing your talent, showing your humanity holds on to that human dignity. So when we think about these moments of how do we celebrate, and also we can also claim that there can be more than one moment a year.
Yeah.
Like we have a lot of civic holidays. There can be more than one moment a year that we do that and come together as community and come together as a larger community and bring into that narrative and say, how can I, as a white person, learn about it? And how can I support other people through that? So I know we talked about this years ago, you talked about these celebrations of Juneteenth and how people can really organize around that, both for the understanding from people in the Black and brown community about that being their day, but also the white community supporting that. So you could talk a little bit about how do we come together and move this as a nation forward?
Yeah. No, I mean, the end of slavery is a national event. It's not just that Black people are free. The institution of slavery is ending, so freedom by definition gets expanded. That's critically important. That has a national impact. So in no way, I mean, this is the barbecue that all white people are invited to, right? Y'all can come. Don't bring any food. That's handled. Right? Just don't be experimenting. Just show up. Right? You can sit down, you can listen as we're doing here, you ask your questions, but it is a national event. It's a shame that it took 150 some years for the nation as a whole to say, you know what, we need to pause and mark the end of the institution of slavery. We were on the wrong side of history for that as a nation for a century, and the fact that we were able to move beyond is not a small thing. The reason why we didn't, is because we got wrapped up in that lost cause lie, right? That this idea, and we were still had this enslaver's mentality. Like we didn't have this sort of national moment where we have ever said slavery was wrong. We just never did it. Like Germany, you can compare. Germany is like, no, Holocaust was wrong. Like we were wrong as a state, should never have happened. We haven't had that. So even with Juneteenth, it's like, hey, let's focus on the celebration and not enough focus on the commemoration, on what it was, on what the horrors of it were. And then now we're actually moving. We were doing better. The conversations that we were having, the conversations that you used to have, the Constitution Center, saying, look, we're gonna look seriously at this history, right? And then you had, in the summer of 2020, following the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and so many others, we actually had the largest protest in American history. And we act like that didn't happen, right? I mean, you had 30 to 40 million people in 2 consecutive months taking to the streets, demanding justice for the victims of police violence. We understand that. But we also had millions of young people taking to the streets, demanding an end to systemic racism. They were like, systemic racism is wrong. We got to bring an end to that. And there's only 2 responses, if you are a person of power, that you can have to a call to end systemic racism. Either change systems and structures to do something about it or do nothing. And those who benefited from the existing status quo were like, we're not going to do anything. And if you're not going to do anything, then you have to provide a public rationalization and justification for it. And that became, we don't have to do anything about systemic racism because systemic racism isn't real. That these kids who are calling for an end to it, they don't know what they're talking about. Little Kylie, because it's always Kylie. Little Kylie doesn't know what she's talking about because she's been what? Indoctrinated with critical race theory. She's been indoctrinated with diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? And so that's critical. I mean, that's just not an accident. That was a response to the work that had actually been successful. We could have had more, but historic sites saying we're going to engage with these conversations of justice were having an impact. And people were like, yeah, we need to do something about it. In the classroom, in corporations, and those who were like, nope, that's too much, because now you're talking about, my bottom line, my privilege. That's in question, so we're going to have a pushback. So now, all that's being rolled back, right? That is a direct response, an assault on the quality of education, on educational truth, because educational truth was breaking through.
And that was actually one of our questions online, was about, how are we connecting this to the pushback on diversity, equity, inclusion today that we're seeing across the country, and around getting back to that truth. And we have taught on these topics for years together, and you do this with your students, and I think it's really helpful for everybody in this room if you're wondering where the truth is and where the truth lies, or somebody's having trouble understanding it and just getting through it. Look at the documents.
Oh, yeah.
Look at the documents directly. Do we want to talk about, the Civil War wasn't about slavery? Oh, no. Just look at the documents. So when you're working with your students kind of on this process, and people they're not just grappling with trying to understand it, they're going through the past information that they've been told that may not be true. And they're also grappling with that relationship they had with the person that gave them that truth. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot that you're unpacking there for people. They have to say, you've said this before, like, Mrs. Smith in the 3rd grade lied to me. Like, this is like, that's a lie. That's not true. And so they're processing through all of that, because we're human beings, and we learn through social constructivism. We build things around us through experiences, through learning, through the people and the interactions and the relationship. That's how we hold on to those memories. So you're attacking a lot of memories when you're doing that. So when we have a group of people that say, I want to go out there and talk about the commemoration and the celebration, what are some of the tools that they can have to have a healthy dialogue and get people to the truth without, because we know, shoving it down their throat doesn't work either.
Right,
so how do we get them to the truth?
It's a challenge, right? And we have to be, and it has become even more challenging, I think, in the current environment in which we are in. And because, one, you always have to start where people are, which is critically important. I mean, this is fundamentals of both teaching and organizing, right? Understanding where people are. And just as you said, when you're presenting folk with this information that is running completely counter to the historical narratives that they have come up with, the Disney version of the past that they've been exposed to, they wind up going through literally the 5 stages of grief, right? It's denial, then it's anger, then it's bargaining, then it's depression, right? Before you finally get to acceptance. And I see that with my students all the time, every semester. Like, here we go, right? But at the end, you want to get them to that 5th stage, which is acceptance, accepting that this history happened. It doesn't make you a bad person because Mimar was a racist, right? That's just the reality of what it was, right? That's who she was. There's no shame or blame in that, right? You're not responsible for that. We weren't around. You're not responsible, even most of us, for what's going on today. Certainly our kids aren't responsible for the madness that they're seeing today, whether it's here or overseas, but our children are responsible for the future. That's why we have to teach this stuff honestly. And so taking that into consideration, like, we don't have a choice whether or not to talk honestly about the past, whether we are in historic sites or whether we are in the classroom or whether we're family members or in the community. Like, that's a non-option, non-starter for me, right? As an educator, as a teacher, I don't take a Hippocratic oath, but if I did, the first thing would be like, do no harm. And when you don't tell the truth or you withhold the truth, you are doing harm, right, in real time. So we can't do that. So the question then becomes, how do we have these conversations? This is where understanding where people are becomes really important, right? Because you can't drop some heavy stuff on them, right? You can't present things like, for me teaching rural white kids from Ohio, I know on day one I can't walk in and say something that I know to be true, because many of them will reject it just because I said it. I got to show them, not in my words. You're talking about the Civil War and slavery. Don't take my word for it. here, read this speech, the cornerstone speech by Stephen A. Douglas, who says slavery is the cornerstone of the Confederacy, right? Like in their own words. Like I love the old school white supremacists, right? Because they was like, look, we're just gonna tell you what we believe, right? Those are coming back, right? I'm like, all right, I guess that's one good thing about your rate, you taking your hood off. Like, but so like, but understanding how to present information, right, is critically important, right? To sort of walk people through, realizing what sort of internal barriers that they have. As you said, this is deeply personal, right? You're like talking about slavery. If you go to the average white person and be like, hey, let's talk about slavery, I'm not responsible. Ain't nobody say you were, right? But you got to understand how this has impacted communities, including your community, right? Like, I was an immigrant. I was an Irish immigrant. Yeah, and at a certain point, as an Irish immigrant, you became white and benefited from those resources that were deprived to people of color, right? So, like, again, not saying responsible, but you got to understand the ways in which this has impacted and shaped opportunities for you and denied opportunities for others. But then I think we also have to be realistic that not everybody is going to be open to these conversations. And I say this to you as an educator, that you can't educate everybody. And especially in this day and age. Like I get asked a lot of times, in a public conversation, something like this, it's like, well, how can I talk to my Uncle Ned, who is full MAGA, right? And I'm like, you can't. You can't. Because we're not dealing with reality anymore. We're not dealing with folk, like 40% of the country is no longer interested in facts that have happened. Like their entire view of the present and of the past is rooted in just what people tell them. It's a religion, it's faith. And if we were talking about the Abrahamic religions here in America, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, all rooted in faith. Faith is belief in the absence of fact. And that's what politics and our history teaching has almost become and what they want. No, don't believe the fact. Believe what I tell you. If that's your position, there's nothing that I can present to you that's going to move you off your belief, because your belief isn't rooted in fact. Your belief is rooted in faith. That doesn't work with history, and it doesn't work with politics and policy either. And so we're in that position. So one of the things I think we have to determine is, when you engage in these conversations, is this actually somebody I can have a conversation with? Because I'm not having conversations with people I can't have a conversation with. Like, life is too short for that. So I'm not doing that. So not everybody is worthy of your time. And so you have to decide whether, not just talking about the random people, but do I love this person? Because this is where it really gets personal, right? Do I love this person enough to exert the energy that it will take, not just in one conversation, not just in two, but in 20 and 30 and 40, to get this person to see reality? That's a love question. Because I'm not going to do that with your Uncle Ned. That's up to you, right? Or your wife, or your husband, or your sibling, or your cousin, or your neighbor. So we have to make those personal decisions. And in the end, it is about that education piece, but then it's also about action, right? Because it's just as in the classroom, if we get kids from that not believing, not knowing, not believing, through those 5 stages to acceptance. By the end of the semester, then as teachers, we've done our job, right? If you can understand the arc of criminal justice and injustice in America, when you walk in the doors and when you exit, you've done your job, right? But then there's a 6th stage that I hope my students will get to, that I think it's safe to say I hope your visitors will get to, is that after that acceptance of the historical reality, you take some action, right? You do something about it. What are you going to do with this knowledge that you now have? Because we're still dealing with an unjust world. That doesn't mean you got to solve every problem or be a part of every fight, but you got to do something. Like, that's the charge, I think, that we still have to level to people, because injustice just does not disappear. Injustice has to be taken on. And as you had said, this is a question at the core of injustice that we're seeing today is robbing people of their humanity. And so when you see folk who are being swept up off the streets, and we're seeing some of these conversations now, and on the, Twitter sphere and all this other stuff, Like among black folk, we just talk about black folk. See, white people invited to the picnic barbecue, y'all just got to listen to some stuff. Like among black folk, right, they're like, look, Latinos, y'all voted in higher percentages for Donald Trump, talking about mass deportations. So this is your fight now, right? Yeah, this is on y'all. We just going to sit back. And it's unfortunate, but y'all just got to deal with this now. And I'm like, that's not the way freedom works, right? Like a threat to justice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, right? And it is a question of, like, yeah, you may have been disappointed, right, in that 45% or so within that demographic, but I don't care, right? That is questioning. That's robbing people, denying people of their humanity. Plus, folk who are undocumented, non-citizens, they can't vote anyway, so they're not a part of that at all. But we cannot let that happen because part of that is this effort. I mean, the two most racism in America is the most powerful political organizing tool that this nation has ever created. And as black folk, we've experienced that directed at us, and now we're seeing that playing out in new ways directed at sort of migrants of color, immigrants of color, whether they have papers or not. But for black folk, it's like, for me, I'm like, do you not realize that we didn't arrive on the Mayflower, that we were imported in the hulls of slave ships? And if we were imported, we can be exported. We can be deported, right? That leap is not a long leap. It's not a far leap. So mess around and be like, that's unfortunate. And wait until we start getting rounded up. Because they're like, yo, you spoke with an accent. You sounded like you were Dominican or you were Haitian. Or now you have these bands on folk coming in from West Africa, from East Africa, and Southern Africa, and the like. Like come on. Like, we don't have time. We don't have the luxury. We don't have the privilege of allowing other people's rights to be taken away in our sight. We just don't.
So, yes, thank you. That's what I needed. Two things I want to echo, and then I do want to turn it over to the audience for questions. We can do a couple of questions. One, when you talk about love and the intersectionality between love and justice, and I always go back to that Cornel West quote that justice is love out loud. That intersection was so powerful when we think about the civil rights movement, when we think about all those movements. It's about how do we see love out loud, and do you extend that, and who do you extend it to, Uncle Ned, those pieces. And two, it really is the final call to every single person in this country. What will you do with freedom? You may not have the freedoms you want. We may need to struggle for more, but you still have a power there. What will you do with the freedom that you do have, and how can you leverage it for others as a whole and as a community? Now, I'd love to have a couple questions out there. If you have a question, just raise your hand. Oh, real quick. And Brandon's going to go around with the mic.
And FYI, I'm going to hold the mic, too, just because we don't want folks staying on their soapbox for longer than we have our featured guest here. So, were you?
I just have a question about how do you fight for eyeballs anymore when you're trying to educate people, especially the younger generation who, I have 18 and 23-year-olds, so attention spans are literally like this big. So going deep, now that they're out of high school, is challenging. And they're both engineers, so they're not going to get it in college.
No, the question I hope everyone was able to hear about how do you win the battle for the attention, and that is always a question that organizers have to face. I think one of the things that we do that is unfortunate is that our model for organizing is very much sort of civil rights era. And we look back and talk about the civil rights era as though everybody participated. Everybody was 100% in it, right? I mean, I remember asking a student one time, I said, how many people, they were going in a particular direction. I said, how many people do you actually think were at the March on Washington? Right? It's 250,000 people. It's like, how many people do you actually think were there? And straight face, he was like, everybody. And I was like, everybody? Right? It was like, everybody was like, he's like, yeah, everybody. So I say that to say, like, generally speaking, we're not going to get everybody. right? We're going to get a small percentage of folk who are really interested, who are really dedicated, and who are really committed to this thing called justice. But how do you get those folk, right, that are out there who in their hearts may feel this, but it's just sort of untapped? How do you get their attention? And as you were saying, with your own kids and the like, I think each person is sort of, is different. Certainly in this age, our children's attention span is a lot shorter. Like, good luck handing them a book and saying, hey, if you read this, you'll be ready for the revolution. Because that shit ain't going to happen, right? But what are their areas of interest? I mean, this is always, I think, this sort of useful to organizers. Organizers did this in civil rights area. You go into a community, you don't go in telling people what they should be interested in, right, and fighting for. You go in asking them, what are you interested in, right? Is it healthcare? Is it criminal justice? Is it education, right? Is it the neighborhood? Is it sports? No matter what it is, there is injustice that is connected that needs to be addressed. And so once you are sort of able to identify that sort of area of interest, because the area of interest is critical, because this isn't just a one-day thing or one-week thing or one-year thing. This is a lifelong journey. And once you see it, you cannot then unsee it. And then they begin to say, okay, what can we do about it, right? That's that education. But you start with identifying. This is sort of the cheat code, right? What is it that this person who I want to see do more, what is it that they're actually interested in? What area animates them? And then begin that process. And in this day and age, again, it's not usually with the text, right? But it can be a visit to a historic site, the power of a place. It can be a documentary film that's connected to something, right? Using that visual and the experiential, and then you'll see that they'll want to start learning on their own. And then they'll start doing the reading. Then they'll start doing the digging. But we also have to remember, we have in our back pockets, in our cell phones, access to more information than anyone has ever had in human history, right? So not knowing is not an excuse. But we just have to sometimes prime them to dig, to learn, and to explore.
And there's a new study out that echoes everything with data that you just said. It's more in common, and it looks at Gen Z, and it's quite depressing. And it's about 50% of the study showed that they didn't believe in democracy or the Constitution, even though it is a flawed document. I love the line of, but it's our document, so do we lean into it and fix it? But it's around the issues, around what is that thing that drives them in. Is it the Park Service? Is it all these pieces? And then you can go through it that lens that way. Another question?
Hi. Speaking of Gen Z, I'm a Gen Z history teacher at St. Joe's Prep.
You know what? And trust your teachers. Give the teachers support, too. Big round of applause for teachers.
My question for you, Dr. Jeffries. As a history teacher, it was very difficult to find the time needed to educate about Africa and the slave trade based on how the textbook is laid out. What advice do you give to teachers who identify a need in what we're given as a curriculum and we want to go the extra mile? Like, what do you say to that?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And one, I think you're asking the right question and you're coming from the right place, right? Understanding that state standards usually are flawed in the sense that they don't provide enough opportunities or focus. Textbooks rarely provide the kinds of points of entry that we need to explore these issues. And we're too often required to, as teachers, K-12, to teach to a test, right? So what then do? We throw our hands up and walk away? No, that's why you're here, right? It's like, okay, what can we do? I'll share this. One of the things that, this is a little bit trickier for you, K through 12. It's a little trickier than I can do in college. But over the last 23 years that I've been teaching at Ohio State, I probably teach about 40% less content than I did when I began. And so I'm teaching less but digging in more, right, on specific subjects. And I do that because I've realized that they can learn more by digging deeper and remember more, right? And by digging deeper, I mean not just like, hey, I'm going to throw more facts at you about one particular thing, but hey, we're going to read something about this, right? We're going to read a first-person account. We're going to watch a film. I want you to feel this history, right? And so I'm saying, try to figure out ways not to cram in more, but to choose selective topics throughout that will allow you to explore these various aspects. And it may be that you're doing chronological leaps back that you otherwise wouldn't have done, right? So, like, look, we need to talk about West Africa, right? And that doesn't mean that we have to begin there. That could mean that you're introducing, if you're teaching early American history, you get to a point where you're talking about black families in the South or in Philadelphia or free folk here in Philadelphia, and you say, hey, you know what, we got to go back to Africa, right? And so thinking about that, you know, chronologically, not being bound by this sort of forward motion, but saying, hey, we're going to jump back and forth, and then thinking about ways to sort of really focus in on sort of a smaller topic that allows you to touch these various aspects. And then finally, I would say, always telling your students, this is the beginning, this is not the end, right? This is the beginning of this history. We're only touching the surface. So even though they may never get to it, they'll always know that there's more.
Very good. One more. And then we're going to turn it over back to the band. Choir.
Hi, this is great, and I'm not going to waste any more time. First of all, I have a question for Dr. Sautner and also for Jeffries. For Dr. Sautner, can you talk a little bit about the very first inmate here at Eastern?
You read my mind. I was going there.
And also, for Dr. Jeffries, can you make a comment as far as what's going on the attack against birthright citizenship?
You start on that one, I'll end.
So in 1857, the Supreme Court rules in the case involving Dred Scott, who was an enslaved African American, is brought to Missouri. Enslaved person brought to a free territory sues for his freedom, and the Supreme Court rules. Chief Justice writes the majority opinion. Chief Justice Roger Taney, and says that formally the enslaved person is not free because black people have no rights. Have no rights. Not just enslaved people, black people have no rights which the white man is bound to respect. Supreme Court of the United States, 1857, 4 years before the Civil War. So fast forward, the Civil War happens, you get the 13th Amendment, then you get the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment is designed to rectify and say, like, no. This idea that black people have no rights which a white man is bound to respect is null and void, because anybody who is born here, anybody who is here or becomes a naturalized citizen has full citizenship rights. So the idea of birthright citizenship, being born in a place and having full citizenship, and that's all it requires, or being born to parents who are citizens, being all that is required, was necessary to prohibit the infringement of African American civil rights and human rights. That didn't mean that those rights would actually weren't going to be infringed upon, because they were. We got 100 years of Jim Crow that follows that. But that was in violation of the Constitution. And the Constitution is the highest, the Constitution in our legal system in America is the supreme law of the land. And so, but it can be amended, right? And so birthright citizenship was a way to create protections for everyone who was here. And then later on it will be extended to indigenous folks and Native Americans, to make sure that no one's rights could ever be taken away from them again. That's critically important. Now that, even in 1867, when that amendment becomes a part of the U.S. Constitution, you had folk who were opposed to it, who were adamantly opposed to it. They said, no, we want to. Why? Because we want to be able to infringe upon their rights. We want to be able to control their labor. We want to be able to move them around however we want to be able to move them around. And so when you fast forward to today and you have this same conversation, executive order saying we're going to do away with sort of this idea that everyone who was born here, this is how you make it in America, just simply be born here, that somehow that this is wrong, is just a way, another way to get at being able to strip people of fundamental rights and fundamental human rights. The amendment is a protection, and rights that are given, as we just saw with reproductive rights, rights that are given can always be taken away. That's why you have to fight. And we better believe in this moment, not only that got knocked down now, but not only are they coming after that, they're coming after the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Yes. They're coming after they've been coming after the Voting Rights Act. They've been chipping that away. They came after reproductive rights. We know they're coming after, they're chipping away at LGBTQIA+ rights. They're coming after Brown. Clarence Thomas already said in the Dobbs decision that we need to go back and reevaluate Brown. Like, that's a sick, that. Juneteenth freed a lot of people, but not everybody. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. I just want to add one thing to the 14th Amendment is it's when we think about this through the courts, we think about it through the people, we think about it through the executive position. There are clauses in those amendments where Congress can do something too. That's why we get these acts that are being attacked, because Congress has the power in the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendment to enforce it. So when we think about what our role is, it's also to call in each branch of the government to do what's right and to push for it as well. Because Congress could be stepping in here too on so many different areas, and they're not. And they're saying, oh, the courts decided that. They have a role to play in both the success and the failure of upholding our rights and holding them to us. So do we on those pieces. I want to do two things really quickly. I want to thank you so much for coming here. I really appreciate it. And as Hasan knows, that once we become friends, it's like a family. You never leave us. And two, I want to end on something that we believe very importantly here at Eastern State. We believing in not forgetting people's names. So often you walk around this site and you see the stone and the walls and the spaces, and you think about the pain and the trauma, and sometimes even the amazing resilience that happened here. But we forget to talk about the people directly. And so thank you for asking me about the first person incarcerated here. It was in October of 1829, and it was Charles Williams, and he was an African-American man. And he was incarcerated here and then moved out. And we need to dig in these stories, and we need to understand why was he incarcerated. And we need to think back of the original intent of this site is to do better, to do more, to understand that everybody has human dignity. But what it didn't grapple with, and that we need to grapple with, is how is the system setting this up to create this pain and trauma, and not about just the wrongs that somebody might have done, but also the pain and trauma that has been caused to them. How do we understand both somebody that has done a crime and a victim, not as two different identities, but as two that are connected, two sides of the same pieces? So when we think about Charles Williams, we want to dive into and learn more, and then we need to talk about people and say, who is that person? Because when we're talking about birthright citizenship, when we're talking about the Dred Scott decision, we talk about Harriet Scott, and Dred Scott. And the reason they fight for it is because they're fighting for their daughters, because that was not going to happen to them. Because those personal stories is what moves people to say, hey, Uncle Ned, we're talking about the kid down the street. I want you to meet him. And that moves people. So thank you so much for coming. Have a wonderful Juneteenth, and please reach out to us if you want to engage more. We'd love to have you again, online or on site. So thank you all. Have a great day.